Good afternoon. My name is Manuel Roman Lacayo. I am the Associate Director for the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. Welcome. We are glad that you could join us. Today, we have another episode in the series of Crimes Against Humanity in Latin America, a series that highlights some of the atrocities that have occurred, that have still effects in the region, in different countries, and on particular populations. It also hopefully highlights some paths forward. Today, it is no coincidence that we have del Femi-Juvenicidio al Neoliberarchivo, Art, Archives, and the Pursuit of Human Rights, a discussion on femicide along the US-Mexico border. We did plan this event in order to highlight some of the struggles, especially in Mexico, a place that you may have seen today increased coverage for also in the framework of International Women's Day. With us today, we have Adriana Miramontes Olivas. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Pittsburgh and the Department of Art and History of Architecture. Her major research interests include global contemporary art, the plurality of global modernisms, and art from Mexico. The focus of her research is on border art histories and contemporary forms of violence that include gender violence as seen in femicidios, and the murder of young men, which are termed juvenicidios, caused by narco wars and economic and necropolitical systems that disregard life. She examines these themes in performance, site-specific installations, and video art. And I want to give your attention over to Adriana, please.
Thank you, Manuel. It is a pleasure to be here on International Women's Day to talk about the pursuit of social justice. So I'm going to proceed and share my screen with all of you, and thank you all for being here today. Well, I would like to start this presentation by first acknowledging that I am a longtime border resident and that I identify as a fronteriza or border resident. My research is influenced and informed by my experience of living, studying, and working in the Mexico-US border in the twin cities of Ciudad Juárez, El Paso, in Chihuahua and Texas, for a period of about 17 years from 1992 to 2009. For my bachelor's degree, I crossed La Frontera, the border, daily to attend the University of Texas at El Paso, and I will return after class at the end of the day back to home in Ciudad Juárez. And we can see that here, some images. Throughout those years, I witnessed the uncontrollable growth of maquiladoras or export processing factories in this area. Read about fellow Juarenses who were victims of heinous crimes and watched criminal violence take over the city. While I now speak and write from the US, my family is still in Mexico, and I continue my contact with the border for both academic and personal reasons. Then, as feminist Gloria Anzaldúa and critical theorist Homi Bhabha explain, I do my research from a third space, a space in between the US and Mexico, in between cultures and languages. It is as a fronteriza that I ask, how do contemporary artists respond to violence as it is lived and witnessed in the Mexico-US border? How do artists address current crisis exacerbated by a global neoliberal machine that is working in collusion with the states and a criminal class? And how do artists subvert hegemonic political and economic rhetoric to appeal to ethical behavior and social justice? I will briefly explore these questions in about 30 minutes or so to allow for Q&A at the end. And Based on the topic of this event, I will also provide contextual information on the history of gender violence in Ciudad Juárez, define terms such as feminicidios and juvenicidios, discuss the Campo Golonero or cotton field case, and others such as Lote Bravo, Lomas de Poleo, and Arroyo el Navajo, and provide some resources for further research regarding crimes against humanity in Mexico. In this slide, you can see one of the international bridges that divide the two border cities and the entry point into Ciudad Juárez at Puente Internacional Las Américas, also known as Córdoba. In 1993, Ciudad Juárez gained national and international attention when several women appeared dead throughout the city. These women were of different ages, and their bodies, both clothed and unclothed, appeared discarded in parks, municipal dumpsters, near high schools, and on emptied lots. They were students, maquiladora or factory workers, and women working in a variety of other businesses. They were either local residents or even migrants to the border who had recently relocated. Information on other victims remains unknown, as their bodies were never claimed or identified. The reported disappearances and murders were first isolated cases, but in 1995, illegal burial sites where multiple bodies were disposed of were located. The first open burial site of the victims of feminicidios was located near the Ciudad Juárez International Airport in a then deserted area called Lote Bravo, where originally 8 bodies were found in 1995. In 1996, 8 bodies were found just south of the border with the United States in the neighborhood of Anapra in Lomas de Poleo, an area known for its shanty housing. In 2001, violence against women continued as 8 more bodies were found in the then outskirts of the city in a cotton field called Campo Golonero, located now in a major avenue and not too far from the US consulate. Cerro de Cristo Negro, also in Anapra, was the dumping site of 6 women's bodies discovered between 2002 and 2003. Yet the largest illegal burial site has been identified in an area in the east in the Valley of Juárez, about 50 miles south from the border with the US, known as Arroyo el Navajo, where 24 women were found between 2008 and 2013. In 2020, women continue to disappear, are murdered, and their bodies discarded throughout the city. As we see here, in 2012, the government started this visual campaign to raise awareness and increase the reporting of information concerning disappearances. The statement says, disappearances in Juárez need to disappear. While there have been people prosecuted for these crimes, this continued disappearance and murder of women over decades raises numerous questions regarding perpetrators, forensic methods, and judicial processes. Families of the victims of gender violence have complained for decades of neglect, inconsistencies, and misinformation. According to decolonial feminist Rita Laura Segato, these kinds of crimes can only be committed by a highly organized network that ensures its operations continue over an extended period. These crimes and crime scenes are intended as messages between groups of people who aspire to control territory, bodies, and resources. As Segato explains, the objective is to, quote, exhibit power before their business competitors, local and federal authorities, activists, scholars, and journalists who dare to get mixed up in their sacred domain, or the victims' fathers, brothers, and male friends. These requirements and forms of exhibitionism are characteristics of the patriarchal regime of a mafia order, unquote. The spectacle of gender violence in Ciudad Juarez for this long is only made possible with the participation of numerous agents, institutions, and accomplices. Social scientist Julia Estela Monares Fregoso insists violence against women happens due to the commodification of bodies, where women are treated as objects to be used and discarded upon the landscape as objects of no value. Other factors cited by Monares Fregoso include the exploitation and disregard of bodies by capitalism, globalization, and industrialization, as well as class, age, and race. This discrimination against women has been sanctioned by the state and other power structures, depriving women of basic rights, such as the right to live, the right to be safe, or the right to transit without being bullied, persecuted, or disappear. Under the border context, the state, transnational corporations, and criminal organizations are all responsible for this disconcerting violence that attacks and undermines women. These crimes have been conceptualized as feminicidios or feminicides and include the murder and disappearance of women. According to feminist Marcela Lagarde y de los Rios, in Spanish, femicidio corresponds to homicide and is only a reference to the homicide of women. But feminicidio constitutes a combination of violations of women's rights, such as the disappearances of women. While the indiscriminate disposal of tortured female bodies has been open and hyper-visible since the early 1990s, the disposal of male bodies was originally more discreet and hidden from public view. It was until 1999 that the first narcofosas or narco burials were discovered and unearthed in the outskirts of Ciudad Juarez, when 4 clandestine sites were uncovered. Since then, illegal burial sites have multiplied throughout the country. As this cover illustrates, today it is estimated that more than 120,000 people have been killed in Mexico. More than 60,000 people have disappeared since 2006, and there are some 4,000 clandestine burial sites throughout the country. These victims of violence have been largely young men, victims of a so-called war on drugs started in 2006 during President Felipe Calderón's government. It led to the militarization of the country and to what border scholar Héctor Padilla calls a maquinaria del terror, or a machinery of terror, which displays within the urban context violence, executions, and bodies to either terrorize society or bring back justice. As part of this machinery of terror, dead bodies are left on the streets and or are hung from bridges with narcomantas or narco warnings on corpses to intimidate society at large, announce new targets, or to justify the killing of subjects. Narcomantas are also used to incriminate other groups, to deny responsibility, and to deliver direct messages to the police, the military, government authorities, or other individuals. According to sociologist José Manuel Valenzuela, the murder of young people, as it occurs in Mexico, can best be described as juvenicidios. Their deaths are justified as a social cleansing of drug traffickers, gang members, extortionists, kidnappers, or thieves. Young people are stigmatized, and in a precarious economy, their present and future remains uncertain. The contribution of young people to the country is considered irrelevant and unnecessary, as are their lives. Thus, the bodies of young people are not only criminalized, but neglected, discarded, disappear, or killed. And the most famous case is that of Ayotzinapa in the southern state of Guerrero, in which 43 students disappeared on September 2014. And this is a text that this artist's book illustrates in green, Ayotzinapa, Political Disappearances. From this series of crimes, the Mexican state has been accountable in only a few of the feminicidios. In 2009, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights declared Mexico guilty of violating human rights. Accused of discrediting families of the victims of feminicidios, of failing to properly investigate disappearances, and of neglecting a context of gender violence, Mexico was judged responsible for the 2001 murder of 3 women in El Caso del Campo Golonero in the border area of Ciudad Juárez in Chihuahua. While the court's ruling represents a victory for justice, these 3 cases constitute only 0.6% of the total 494 feminicidios committed in Ciudad Juárez from 1993 to 2007. And here we see several crosses with the names of some of the victims. The pink crosses, the pink in color pink, have become an icon, very representative of the feminicidios in Ciudad Juárez. The court also ruled Mexico had to create a memorial site at the former Campo Golonero where the victims were found, and we see here the memorial. This failure to hold government authorities accountable and to prosecute more cases has worsened conditions in the city, leading to, as I mentioned earlier, the continued disappearance of women and to the juvenicidios of more than 8,000 men from 2008 to 2011 in Ciudad Juárez alone. Despite the heinous crimes being committed, government officials and a variety of community leaders have remained indifferent to the atrocities, blame the victims of feminicidios, and argue the victims of the war on drugs are collateral damage and a social cleansing of criminals. My questions include, how do contemporary artists respond to this context and atrocities? How do artists examine an uninterrupted culture of corruption, terror, and death? As we can see here, some artists have chosen painting. Brian Maguire has interviewed families of the victims of feminicidios and painted their daughters using photographs provided by the mothers. Since 2005, Lisa Dorn has been encouraging the creation of name tags with the names of victims of gender violence around the world. It first was inspired by the feminicidios of Ciudad Juárez, but the project has now extended to include victims from other areas. And here you can see my mom sewing a woman's name in 2017 at the university's gallery at El Paso, Texas. This is an ongoing project. Judith Hernandez has painted deserted landscapes and women in reference to both the context and the victims. Other artists have chosen photography, as we can see here, where the artists focus on the mothers of the disappeared and the spaces left behind. The focus of my research is on the Neoliberarchivos and artists Teresa Margolles and Enrique Hesik, and I will be talking about them in the context of the archive and neoliberalism. Irrigation, that we see here, is a video by artist Teresa Margolles. It shows an irrigation water truck driving east on Highway 90 in Texas. The truck departs from Marfa and arrives half an hour later in Alpine. Traversing the deserted landscape, Highway 90 runs parallel to a large section of the Mexico-US border. In this journey, the truck takes viewers through the largely desolate scenery where the viewer and driver eventually see familiar signs such as a Dairy Queen, Exxon, and a Holiday Inn. Yet the focus in irrigation is on the truck's back. Ignoring the truck's driver, the video calls attention to the water the truck spreads across the paved road. A total of 5,000 gallons of water were used to perform this action. The water being dispersed had originally been mixed with clothes that wipe clean crime scenes in the border area of Ciudad Juárez in Chihuahua, Mexico. By presenting an artwork made with a mix of water and clothes used to clean the streets where violence took place, Margolles archives the crime scene, refuses to keep silent, and extends her critique and the traces of bodies within the gallery space, across Highway 90 and beyond. Margolles' distribution of polluted water in the United States and on a road that is parallel to the border with Mexico informs viewers that violence is not localized, but its causes and consequences are multiple, dispersed, and global. In this sense, Margolles not only challenges notions of border violence, but incriminates a variety of governments, institutions, and individual actors. She implicates big corporations and states that participate in the deregulation of markets and the precarization of labor, undermining lives as seen in the Feminicidios and Juvenicidios. In Margolles' irrigation, the irrigation truck is a protagonist of terror, a creature representing political, social, and economic forces working in collaboration locally and globally in destroying lives in favor of wealth accumulation and power. Margolles' irrigation documents violence and subverts a politics of denial. 6 cubic meters of organic material is a site-specific installation that took place in the border area of Ciudad Juárez in Mexico in 2009. Viewers can see a desolate landscape with bushes, 2 black SUVs, a tractor, and a dump truck at the end of a precipice. The truck is filled with guts and is discarding them upon the landscape. Here, the animal guts represent human bodies and exemplify violence as seen in Ciudad Juárez with the disposal of bodies in the Feminicidios and Juvenicidios. According to Hesik, this action alludes to the unstoppable bloodshed that has been happening in Mexico in recent years. Also, let us recall that in 2009, when 6 cubic meters of organic material was created, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights declared Mexico guilty of violating human rights in the disappearance and murder of 3 women. In his 6 cubic meters of organic matter, the worker or driver of the truck remains out of the scene, marginalized, neglected. It is the machine, as in Margolles' artwork, the one that plays a central role. The machines appear actively discarding liquids, the traces and symbols of bodies as they are disposed of in our contemporary society. The machines in both Hesik and Margolles symbolize a sovereign power that exerts a right to kill. The machines represent decentralized powers formed by multiple agents across spaces. By harshly representing this disregard for life, Hesig engages in a strong condemnation of the present and recent past and the discrimination of women, migrants, workers, and others. By confronting viewers with such a violent encounter, Hesig not only denounces a state apparatus acting in conjunction with a neoliberal global regime, but also reminds viewers that unless we engage with our ethical obligations towards one another, violence and the right to kill will continue to operate in a massive scale. I define the neoliberal archivos as acting simultaneously as artworks and archives. As artworks, the neoliberal archivos evidence the negative consequences of the collusion between markets and states within a global art apparatus. As archives, the neoliberal archivos document discrimination, disappearances, and the loss of lives that a network of governments, enterprises, and criminal class aim to hide, ignore, or underestimate, as is seen in the border area of Ciudad Juarez. The neoliberal archivos show the tragic consequences of the dehumanization and devaluation of life, and they remind viewers of the cost in human lives of aggressive and economic political practices. Unlike archives, the neoliberal archivos subvert canonical definitions of the archive as a collection of texts and take on a variety of contemporary art forms that include video art and site-specific artworks. As artworks and archives, I define the neoliberal archivos as a form of protest that condemn neoliberalism by embracing and exposing its harsh brutality. The neoliberal archivos contradict political leaders and businessmen discourses and policies in which reality and facts are manipulated to maintain or display a good business climate. The neoliberal archivos challenge misinformation and the absence of memory in reference to the feminicidios and juvenicidios, and support activist efforts to account for victims. Thus, the neoliberal archivos are horizontal, created by artists with a desire to present an alternative reality to that offered by state rhetoric and entrepreneurs. Subjected to the forces of neoliberalism, the neoliberal archivos take advantage of the freedom advocated by this rationale to cross borders and participate in the art market and in international exhibitions, enjoying global exposure. As many commodities, the neoliberal archivos travel freely, becoming even more powerful as portable archives, showing their critique and condemnation in multiple venues around the world. The neoliberal archivos are not only mobile, but at times even ephemeral, challenging notions of stability, permanence, or authoritarianism. The neoliberal archivos are in conversation with the Counter Archive and the Melancholic Archive. The work of Chilean artist Voluspa Harpa exemplifies the Counter Archive. Harpa has worked extensively with the declassified archives from Latin America's dictatorships and the CIA. Since 2001, she has been making these documents visible and invisible by challenging the archive's reliance on order, clarity, and the ability to convey information. In her Counter Archives, Harpa's declassified documents are not there to be researched, but to provide feelings of alienation, unease, and incompleteness. As you can see here, it will be extremely difficult to do any kind of serious research with these documents due to their position within the gallery and also due to the information that has been wiped out. Similar to the Counter Archive, the Melancholic Archive deals with loss, death, and social injustices. According to our historian Claudette Lauzon, the Melancholic Archive is an open wound, an archive or witness to absence, and it fails to provide answers. The shares in these installations by Colombian artist Doris Salcedo represent bodies, the missing people that once used this furniture. The Melancholic Archive activates collective memory, but it also leaves viewers in a constant state of perplexity and incompleteness. The Neoliberal Archivos share many characteristics with the Counter Archive and the Melancholic Archive. First, the Neoliberal Archivos also take place in contested territories where dictators or wars create instability, chaos, and repressive environments. Second, the Neoliberal Archivos also communicate on the complexity of loss, mourning, and death, while they challenge notions of memory, representation and misrepresentation, visibility and invisibility. Third, the Neoliberal Archivos are also fragmented, mobile, and unofficial as they contest hegemonic notions of the archive. Yet, unlike the Counter Archive and the Melancholic Archive, the Neoliberal Archivos account for specific conditions developed in recent decades in which neoliberalism has altered ways of living, thinking, and being. The repetition of trauma and the violation of human rights has been a common issue throughout the Americas and thus a constant topic in contemporary artworks. Here we see a reference to the disappear in Argentina with Fernando Traverso's silk banners. Political scientists Enrique Desmond Arias and Daniel M. Goldstein argue violence in contemporary Latin America is structural to the region's functioning. They claim violence is not a failure of democracy or its institutions, but an integral element. According to Desmond and Goldstein, it is through violence that economic systems and political structures have been established, developed, and maintained. Strikes have been violently suppressed, unions dismantled, and workers intimidated, silenced, or restrained. By using violence, political parties have gained control of territories and retained their power. Political enemies have been investigated, harassed, or even eliminated. Thus, ignoring, neglecting, or diminishing the role violence plays in our countries is not only detrimental, but a futile attempt in understanding or rethinking communities, policies, and plans to move forward. Desmond and Goldstein cite neoliberalism as a key participant in the violence taking place throughout the Americas. As Desmond and Goldstein explain, the ideology of self-realization and self-preservation promoted by neoliberalism has led many in our communities to a violent form of capitalism that seeks economic preservation at any cost, including at the expense of others' lives. Feminist theorist Sajak Valencia calls this gore capitalism to describe the phenomenon in Mexico where torture, kidnapping, and extortion have become a way of making a living. They have also been key factors that have led many to join gangs, mafias, cartels, and vigilantes to protect or empower themselves. Others have relied on private security guards, surveillance systems, barricades, and gated communities, thus paying exorbitant fees for their protection and survival. The state, the police, and the military have proven inefficient in protecting citizens and citizens' rights because it has not been the priority of the state apparatus to ensure basic rights given with budget cuts, the support of corporations as opposed to citizens, an ideology of individualism, or corruption and impunity. The question is, what then is the role of art in these violent contexts? Philosopher and gender theorist Judith Butler explains, quote, "Grievability is differentially allocated such that some do not rise to the level of the grievable, cannot be grasped as lives worth mourning. In the same way that we talk about the unequal distribution of goods or resources, I believe that we can also speak about the radically unequal distribution of grievability," unquote. Contemporary artworks, as those by Margolles and Hesig, act as sites of knowledge, archives of information on what has been deemed ungrievable. They do this to hold others accountable. Through the Neoliberarchivos, these artists subvert the politics of denial and archive a complex, violent reality that would rather be dismissed and forgotten. The Neoliberarchivos appropriate traces of the body to judge an aggressive state apparatus and a devouring neoliberal global machine to demand better lives and justice. They constitute an artistic protest to disrupt the status quo and to subvert official discourses that diminish or neglect violence, criminalize victims, disappears activists or journalists, or threatens families of the disappeared and dead. The Neoliberarchivos remind viewers of their ethical responsibilities to value and preserve life, to provide justice, bring equality, and act in solidarity towards others. As philosopher Susan Sontag writes, "The least we can do is not to show sympathy, but to engage in a reflection regarding the pain of others and how our privilege and well-being is linked to others' suffering." In the form of the Neoliberarchivos, Margolles and Hesig force viewers to speak of the unspeakable, the unacknowledged, and the neglected. Under a complex society that discredits, hides, and employs strategies of misinformation, the Neoliberarchivos act to counteract official discourses and adopted policies, and to encourage reflection, dialogue, and change. Thank you for joining me today in this discussion. Thank you for your time. I want to close this presentation with some sources for further research, including the just mentioned Susan Sontag regarding the pain of others, terrorizing women, feminicide in the Americas, Vida, Muerte y Resistencia in Ciudad Juárez, Courage, Resistance, and Women in Ciudad Juárez, and Sayak Valencia's Court Capitalism. Manuel.
Thank you, Adriana. You know, the normal thing would be to say that's great, except, you know, what you're highlighting is a really dreadful set of dynamics and a continuing problem that just seems to be losing traction, if that makes any sense, in terms of the response from authorities, whether it be municipal or state level authorities in Mexico. And, you know, it's an issue that very clearly here in the United States does not have a lot of traction or a lot of attention. The fact that this is occurring just, I mean, literally just a couple of kilometers from the US border. And, you know, it occurred to me as you were going on, and of course I got to see the presentation prior to, you know, to you making it, sharing it with everybody. you know, the 6 cubic meters of organic matter. I mean, that was especially, you know, especially impactful for me. And I have to confess that I've actually worked on a project that is right next to the municipal dump. So I could see what actually was being disposed from just across the gorge that separated this property I was working on and the actual municipal dump. And it's the first thing that I thought it was, that when you share that with me. And in that respect, I think that because of the brutality and the lethality of what goes on in terms of violence, I wonder what impact this sort of project have on a population that is resigned, apparently, right, to enduring without the help of their representatives and their government and authorities. And I wonder what you feel about that.
Yeah, there have been several exhibitions throughout Mexico, especially in Mexico City and Querétaro, that have presented some of this violence. I know that Hesik's artwork was exhibited instead at El Paso. So it's this idea of looking at violence from certain distance, right, from across the border. The same is true for Teresa Margolles. She has mostly exhibited in El Paso, not so much in Ciudad Juarez. So there is, I have to acknowledge, certain hartazgo, right? People are tired of reading about violence daily on the newspapers, watching it daily on the news, on television, and then on top of that, in their spaces of recreation, right? But it's certainly targeting a different audience, right? It's the gallery visitor, it's the art visitor, and as I mentioned before, an international art audience that may or may not be aware of some of these issues. And you know, we have a question actually from Terry Smith, who shared it in the chat, and I will read it literally. Do you also think that the Neoliberarchivo's artists help make visible the material elements of the disappeared, and also make visible the invisible relationships within the forces that generate the violence? Terry, do you want to tell me more about your question?
So thanks, Adriana. It's a wonderful, really powerful presentation, I think. So I was just, it's kind of obvious when you present the images of all the bodies going down and the water being laid out there. On one level, it's a metaphor, you know, because it's not literally the bodies, but it's body-like material. And it, or in the case of Margolles, it is the water that was used. Not that she even needs that particular water, but water of that amount of water would also do the job, because in one way it's a metaphor. But what is helping, both of them in different ways, are doing what visual art does, make visible what you can see if you were there. So that's in terms of dropping the bodies down the in the gully, but also Margolles often makes visible the kind of connections that we can't see. In other words, if you make someone, if you disappear people, it's a very complex operation to disappear. You know, a whole lot of things have to happen for people to be killed and then buried and, you know, disappeared. As you've been explaining, all these very complex forces operate, but they do things that are mostly out of sight, except for the people who happen to be there when the murders are happening, for example. And so my sense is that what these artists are doing are making visible, making clear things that we normally don't see. In other words, a way of not really, grasping just how horrible all these murders are, is that we can ignore it because we don't actually see it happening most of the time. Hardly ever do we see it happening. As you say, they leave the bodies around to give another message, but the actual violence, which is the thing that has to be seen in order for it to be criminally prosecuted, it's like a kind of rape, rape has to be witnessed in order for it to be fully prosecuted by the law, but by definition, it mostly isn't witnessed. So artists develop these ways of making visible that which normally is not witnessed. So that maybe witnessing is encouraging a kind of substitute witnessing. I'm just trying to bring out a bit more the visual character and the power of the visual image in what you're talking about. So does that make sense, that suggestion, this visual witnessing that we're being obliged to experience as we look at the work?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you grab or call attention to Margolles' visibility and invisibility of violence, because throughout her professional career, her work has developed in dynamic ways, but also it has also become way more stronger. And in some pieces, she has actually relied on a lot more visibility than invisibility. And so she has some pieces like PM. I can think about PM. PM is a series of newspapers from Ciudad Juarez that she collected as sort of like found objects, right? You were talking about art terms, that she collected for about a year. And then she exhibits those in the gallery space. So it's like another sort of archive, right? But what is unique about PM is that it is yellow journalism, amarillista, right? And so it's very graphic. You actually do see on the cover of each page dead bodies, the blood and, horrific things, but also is very sexual, this newspaper, because they have a lot of advertisements for prostitution in the city. So they play with this idea of violence, and then you have the naked woman next to it calling the viewer's attention. And so she has used some works in which the violence is more graphic and is more on display, but certainly those in which is not as visible, more conceptual works, I feel they're stronger and they can open the space for more questions and interventions, conceptual interventions or academic.
Yeah.
And if I may, Gabriela Scott has some follow-ups that I think connect to what you two were just talking about. And she says, it's a very insightful review of 3 different approaches to denouncing transnational human rights abuses and crimes. Do you think that some of these artworks may possibly have the unintended effect of functioning as cautionary tales or triggers in certain portions of the population through the broadcasting of images of violence, hence cooperating with those same politics of terror that they are denouncing? And in this, she refers specifically to Hizik's work about the organic material, where Margolles seems to avoid the graphic representation.
Mm-hmm. Hi, Gabi. Thank you so much for your question. Certainly, they are very emotional artworks. They usually when I teach about them in classes, I do provide the students with a warning prior because, the topics are very difficult, such as gender violence or criminal violence. So I think you got the idea very well, because the neoliberarchivos do participate in that system, right? So they take this violence, they portray it, they embrace this violence in order to exercise the critique. So using your words, yes, they cooperate with those same politics of terror they are denouncing. And I think it's a strategy that the artists are using to call attention to how urgent these messages are, right? It's not something that, oh, we're gonna like to see, we're gonna love to see, and we're gonna drink champagne in the gallery space while the exhibition is in the reception, the opening, right? So it is intended to create those very difficult conversations that we rather not have.
No, indeed. And that's maybe it's why I earlier referred to or emphasized, the work by, about the organic compound, because it is, and not having been involved and not having prior knowledge of much of, in terms of the ways in which artists are, in more organized ways approaching making this more visible, a more visible issue. My as an outsider, as a complete outsider, as a person who basically only spent days, never a single night in Ciudad Juarez. I basically I was only allowed to spend the days there, and I think it was especially impactful to see that, because it is when your work doesn't allow you to have the full experience of a community, when you are constantly being told not to go this, and you just go to do the work that you're supposed to be doing there. Your idea about the place is skewed, right? It's not just about what you're experiencing, it's what you imagine you're not experiencing, you're being saved from. And so in that respect, I can also, I connect rather well to Margolles in the way that, this basically evanesces. It just, it's in the arid weather of Juarez, you put that water down and a few minutes later it's gone. And so it's also, I think, very much the experience of how a lot of people have to live their days, not having to think about this, right? Because otherwise it could be overwhelming.
And I think you bring some important issues to the conversation. And I want to say that Margolles has visited the region. According to Houston curator Gilbert Vicario, Margolles first started visiting Ciudad Juarez in 2005 for an artwork that was commissioned by the Houston Museum of Art. And it is then that she starts engaging with the families of the disappeared. And so she visits the region. I think she was renting a house there at some point as well. So she has been there, involved in the community, getting to know it. And Enrique Hesic has also visited Ciudad Juarez on a couple of occasions after he has been invited for several art residencies and art-specific commissions. But nonetheless, they have been there.
Can I, if I may, just to follow up on Gabriela and Manuel's comments and questions. So Adriana is describing the groundedness of these artists in the area. They're not just visitors. They do, in fact, have a commitment over time to working on these issues as, in fact, the central focus of their work. But one of the reasons why this gets puzzling is I think their main address, the people to whom they're mainly directing their art, are people who look at art a lot. They're actually making statements within an art worlds. And just to try and bring that out in a graphic sort of way, people in art worlds, like people who read a lot of novels or people who live in a certain area, obviously accumulate knowledges and skills and worldviews based on that particular world in which their main interest and focus is. So, for example, everybody looking at the work by Yuzes, the spilling of the bodies over the side of a cliff, will know that he's reenacting a famous work by Robert Smithson that was done in the early 70s in Holland called Asphalt Rundown, where he went to a quarry and a truck full of asphalt put all this bitumen down into the quarry. So he was making a contrast between oil spills and, you know, generating waste by mechanical production against a sort of natural phenomenon. So, whereas in this case, the artist Enrique has picked up that formal gesture, very well-known gesture of earth art or environmental art, ecological sort of ecological gesture, and focused it on this whole process that Adriana's described to us. And similarly, when Margolis shows us the back of a truck and takes us in a fairly straight line from Marfa, you know, where Donald Judd has his great minimal art center, you know, along the border there, she's taking the logic of a minimal artwork, which is to just focus on one thing and follow it from one place to another, and using that and filling what usually is a fairly abstract kind of way of thinking, very minimal and formal material way of thinking. She's infusing it with the whole, you know, horrible world that Adriana's described to us. She's giving that kind of content that it normally doesn't have and is normally excluded. So for art people or people involved in the art world, these are very powerful experiences, because they use the language of art, the language of late modern contemporary art, and they bring in all this kind of content that normally is either just not there, or it more is sometimes, as you showed in the first examples of the portraits, sometimes it's just very directly represented, and that's fine. That's one way of doing it. But these artists are using the language of art to make these points. So I'm just adding that to the conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for adding that. Certainly the artists are in conversation, not only with the Counter archives or the Melancholic archives, but also with minimalism, or as you mentioned, Terry, Earthland or Earth artworks.
Mm-hmm. Many of those minimal artworks were in fact made in that whole district, in the whole sort of southern desert border region, in the 60s and 70s, without much statement about it being borders. You know, I remember I was there. So at that point, it was all about doing this major graphic earthworks. I can't remember anyone bringing up the question of the political history of the border. It just wasn't mentioned. So it's a whole new dimension to the work. Anyway, there you go.
Yeah, well, I think that border was not as visible as it has become now, right? And certainly not. It has. I think it marks an inflection point in U.S. history. The let's say the strength and presence of that border, where, you know, previously it was a demarcation for you know, the reasons that did not respond to what we're experiencing more recently. So I want to thank Adriana. I mean, this is this is tremendous, and the fact that it brings ideas and a world that a lot of us don't inhabit very, very frequently, and connect to a reality that is so challenging and so important for so many people. That's why we welcomed the addition of your presentation to the series about crimes against humanity, because if there's something that fits that title, it's a lot of what these artists and what you've talked about, and it's tremendously important, and so I want to thank you, and I want to thank everybody who's participated in the audience. And Adriana, I don't know if you want to leave us with some concluding statement or.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Manuel, for this opportunity to talk about what is happening in Mexico. I know that the series had an amazing event a couple of weeks ago in Nicaragua, and that in a few weeks we might have another discussion, but this time on Brazil. So certainly I am very grateful for the opportunity to talk about what is happening in Mexico. Also, I want to invite the audience to follow up what is happening today in Mexico City with the 8M, the 8 the protests for International Women's Day, because feminicidios is a big topic on the protests. And Palacio Nacional, or the National Palace, where the current president works and lives, has already been sort of appropriated by several artists. So there's text that has been inscribed upon it with light. And also it has created a lot of controversy because the Mexican president had the palace to be barricaded as some sort of protection from the feminists, the activists. So it's covered by walls. And well, this wall, this muro, this barrier, has already been painted with the names of many people who have disappeared in the country. So just an invitation to follow up today on these events. And thank you also to all the audience members who join us today in the conversation. And I hope we can continue this through email or, a cafe or something. Thank you.
Yes, and let us hope that that can happen in person before too long. That is something that we're really looking forward to. Once again, I want to thank you, and just want to reiterate, your time spent with us and the dedication you put into the presentation. It was great. It was. And I want to thank you on behalf of the center for taking the time and doing this.